But I took this circumstance as a supernatural sign, whether celestial or diabolical I still cannot say, and I bent eagerly to read the writing. It was not very long, and I found there also what Ubertino had not told me, obviously recounted by one who had seen all and whose imagination was still inflamed by it. I learned then how, in March of 1307, on Holy Saturday, Dulcino, Margaret, and Longinus, captured at last, were taken into the city of Biella and handed over to the bishop, who was awaiting the decision of the Pope. The Pope, hearing the news, transmitted it to King Philip of France, writing, "We have received most welcome news, rich in joy and exultation, for that pestiferous demon, son of Belial, the most horrendous heresiarch Dulcino, after many dangers, long efforts, massacres, and frequent battles, is finally incarcerated with his followers in our prisons, thanks to our venerated brother Rainier, Bishop of Vercelli, captured on the day of the Lord's Holy Supper, and numerous people who were with him, infected by the contagion, were killed that same day. The Pope was merciless toward the prisoners and ordered the bishop to put them to death. Then, in July of that same year, the first day of the month, the heretics were handed over to the secular arm. As the bells of the city rang joyously, the heretics were placed in a wagon, surrounded by the executioners, followed by the militia, and carried through the entire city, and at every corner, men with red-hot pincers tore the flesh of the guilty. Margaret was burned first, before Dulcino, who did not move a muscle of his face, just as he had not uttered a moan when the pincers bit into his limbs. Then the wagon continued on its way, while the executioners thrust their irons into pots filled with glowing coals. Dulcino underwent other torments and remained silent, though when they amputated his nose he shrugged a bit, and when they tore off his male member he emitted a long sigh, like a groan. The last things he said sounded impertinent, for he warned that he would rise on the third day. Then he was burned and his ashes were scattered in the wind. I folded the manuscript with trembling hands. Dulcino had committed many crimes, I had been told, but he had been horribly burned to death. And at the stake he had behaved, how? With the steadfastness of martyrs or with the arrogance of the damned? As I staggered up the steps to the library, I realized why I was so upset. I suddenly recalled a scene I had witnessed not many months before, shortly after my arrival in Tuscany. I wondered, indeed, why I had almost forgotten it till then, as if my sick soul had wanted to erase a memory that weighed on me like a nightmare. Or, rather, I had not forgotten it, because every time I heard the Fraticelli discussed, I saw again the scenes of that event, but I immediately thrust them down into the recesses of my spirit, as if witnessing that horror had been a sin. I had first heard talk of the Fraticelli in the days when, in Florence, I had seen one burned at the stake. It was shortly before I met Brother William in Pisa. He had delayed his arrival in that city, and my father had given me leave to visit Florence, whose churches I had heard praised as most beautiful. I wandered about Tuscany, to learn better the vulgar Italian tongue, and I finally stayed a week in Florence, because I had heard much talk of that city and wished to know it. And so it was that when I had barely arrived I learned of a great trial that was stirring up the whole city. A heretic Fraticello, accused of crimes against religion and haled before the bishop and other ecclesiastics, was being subjected to severe inquisition at the time. And, following those who told me about it, I went to the place where the trial was taking place, for I heard the people say that this friar, Michael by name, was truly a very pious man who had preached penance and poverty, repeating the words of St. Francis, and had been brought before the judges because of the spitefulness of certain women who, pretending to confess themselves to him, had then attributed heretical notions to him. And he had indeed been seized by the bishop's men in the house of those same women, a fact that amazed me, because a man of the church should never go to administer the sacraments in such unsuitable places. But this seemed to be a weakness of the Fraticelli, this failure to take propriety into due consideration, and perhaps there was some truth in the popular belief that held them to be not only heretics but also of dubious behavior, as it was always said of the Catholics that they were Bulgars and Sodomites. I came to the church of San Salvador, where the Inquisition was in progress, but I could not enter, because of the great crowd outside it. However, some had hoisted themselves to the bars of the windows and, clinging there, could see and hear what was going on, and they reported it to those below. The inquisitors were reading to Brother Michael the confession he had made the day before, in which he said that Christ and his apostles held nothing individually or in common as property, but Michael protested that the notary had now added many false consequences, and he shouted, "This I heard from outside, you will have to defend yourselves on the day of judgment." But the inquisitors read the confession as they had drawn it up, and at the end they asked him whether he wanted humbly to follow the opinions of the church and all the people of the city. And I heard Michael shouting in a loud voice that he wanted to follow what he believed, namely that he wanted to keep Christ poor and crucified, and Pope John the 22nd was a heretic because he said the opposite. A great debate ensued, in which the inquisitors, many of them Franciscans, sought to make him understand that the scriptures had not said what he was saying, and he accused them of denying the very rule of their order, and they assailed him, asking him whether he thought he understood scripture better than they, who were masters. And Fra Michael, very stubborn indeed, contested them, so that they began provoking him with such assertions as, "Then we want you to consider Christ a property owner and Pope John a Catholic and holy man." And Michael, never faltering, said, "No, a heretic." And they said they had never seen anyone so tenacious in his own wickedness. But among the crowd outside the building I heard many compare him to Christ before the Pharisees, and I realized that among the people many believed in the holiness of the Friar Michael. Finally the bishop's men took him back to prison in irons. And that evening I was told that many monks, friends of the bishop, had gone to insult him and enjoin him to retract, but he answered like a man sure of his own truth. And he repeated to each of them that Christ was poor and that St. Francis and St. Dominic had said so as well, and that if for professing this upright opinion he had to be condemned to the stake, so much the better, because in a short time he would be able to see what the scriptures describe, the 24 elders of the Apocalypse and Jesus Christ and St. Francis and the glorious martyrs. And I was told that he said, if we read with such fervor the doctrine of certain sainted abbots, how much greater should be our fervor and our joy in desiring to be in their midst? And after words of this sort, the inquisitors left the prison with grim faces, crying out in indignation, and I heard them, "He has a devil in him." The next day we learned that the sentence had been pronounced. I went to the bishop's palace, where I could see the parchment, and I copied a part of it onto my tablet. It began, In nomine Domini Amen. Hec est caedam condemnatio corporalis et sententia condemnationis corporalis lauda, data et in his scriptus sententialiter pronuntiata et promulgata, etc., and it went on with a stern description of the sins and crimes of the said Michael. Among these one seemed to me most foul, even if I do not know, considering the conduct of the trial, whether he really affirmed this, but it was said, in short, that the aforementioned Minorite had proclaimed that St. Thomas Aquinas was not a saint nor did he enjoy eternal salvation, but was, on the contrary, damned and in a state of perdition. And the sentence concluded, establishing the punishment, since the accused would not mend his ways. Id circo, dictum Johannem vocatum fratrum Michelum hereticum et schismaticum quod ducator ad locum justitia consutum, et ibidem ein et flammas ignes excensus concremetur et comberator, ida quod penitus moriator et anima a corpore separator. And after the sentence had been made public, more men of the church came to the prison and warned Michael of what would happen, and I heard them say then, Brother Michael, the mitres and copes have already been made, and painted on them are fraticelli accompanied by devils, to frighten him and force him finally to retract. But Brother Michael knelt down and said, I believe that beside the pyre there will be our Father Francis, and I further believe there will be Jesus and the apostles, and the glorious martyrs Bartholomew and Anthony. Which was a way of refusing for the last time the inquisitor's offers. The next morning I, too, was on the bridge before the bishop's palace, where the inquisitors had gathered. Brother Michael, still in irons, was brought to face them. One of his faithful followers knelt before him to receive his benediction, and this follower was seized by the men-at-arms and taken at once to prison. Afterward, the inquisitors again read the sentence to the condemned man and asked him once more whether he wished to repent. At every point where the sentence said he was a heretic, Michael replied, I am no heretic, a sinner, yes, but Catholic, and when the text named, the most venerable and holy Pope John the 22nd, Michael answered, no, a heretic. Then the bishop ordered Michael to come and kneel before him, and Michael said no one should kneel before heretics. They forced him to his knees and he murmured, God will pardon me. And after he had been led out in all his priestly vestments, a ritual began, and one by one his vestments were stripped away until he remained in that little garment that the Florentines call a chopa. And as is the custom when a priest is defrocked, they seared the pads of his fingers with a hot iron and they shaved his head. Then he was handed over to the captain and his men, who treated him very harshly and put him in irons, to take him back to prison, as he said to the crowd, per dominum morimer. He was to be burned, as I found out, only the next day. And on this day they also went to ask him whether he wished to confess himself and receive communion. And he refused, saying it was a sin to accept the sacraments from one in a state of sin. Here, I believe, he was wrong, and he showed he had been corrupted by the heresy of the Patarines. Finally it was the day of the execution, and a gonfalonier came for him, appearing friendly, for he asked what sort of man Michael was and why he was so stubborn when he had only to affirm what the whole populace affirmed and accept the opinion of Holy Mother Church. But Michael, very harshly, said, I believe in Christ poor and crucified. And the gonfalonier went away, making a helpless gesture. Then the captain arrived with his men and took Michael into the courtyard, where the bishop's vicar reread the confession and the sentence to him. Michael interrupted again to contest opinions falsely attributed to him. These truly were matters of such subtlety that I do not recall them, and at that time did not understand them clearly. But these were surely what decided the death of Michael and the persecution of the Fraticelli. I did not understand why the men of the church and of the secular arm were so violent against people who wanted to live in poverty and held that Christ had not owned worldly goods. Because, I said to myself, if anything, they should fear men who wish to live in wealth and take money away from others, and lead the church into sin and introduce simoniacal practices into it. And I spoke of this with a man standing near me, for I could not keep silent any more. He smiled mockingly and said to me that a monk who practices poverty sets a bad example for the populace, for then they cannot accept monks who do not practice it. And, he added, the preaching of poverty put the wrong ideas into the heads of the people, who would consider their poverty a source of pride, and pride can lead to many proud acts. And, finally, he said that I should know, thanks to some syllogism which was not clear to him, either, that preaching poverty for monks put you on the side of the emperor, and this did not please the Pope. All excellent reasons, they seemed to me, even if expounded by a man of scant learning, except that at this point I did not understand why Brother Michael wanted to die so horribly to please the emperor, or to settle a controversy among religious orders. And in fact some of those present were saying, "He is not a saint, he was sent by Louis to stir up discord among the citizens, and the Fraticelli are Tuscans but behind them are the emperor's agents." And others said, "He is a madman, he is possessed by the devil, swollen with pride, and he enjoys martyrdom for his wicked pride. They make these monks read too many lives of the saints, it would be better for them to take a wife." And still others added, "No, all Christians should be like him, ready to proclaim their faith, as in the time of the pagans." As I listened to those voices, no longer knowing what to think myself, it so happened that I looked straight at the condemned man's face, which at times was hidden by the crowd ahead of me. And I saw the face of a man looking at something that is not of this earth, as I had sometimes seen on statues of saints in ecstatic vision. And I understood that, madman or seer as he might be, he only wanted to die because he believed that in dying he would defeat his enemy, whoever it was. And I understood that his example would lead others to death. And I remain amazed by the possessors of such steadfastness only because I do not know, even today, whether what prevails in them is a proud love of the truth they believe, which leads them to death, or a proud desire for death, which leads them to proclaim their truth, whatever it may be. And I am overwhelmed with admiration and fear. But let us go back to the execution, for now all were heading for the place where Michael would be put to death. The captain and his men brought him out of the gate, with his little skirt on him and some of the buttons undone, and as he walked with a broad stride and a bowed head, reciting his office, he seemed one of the martyrs. And the crowd was unbelievably large and many cried, "Do not die." And he would answer, "I want to die for Christ." "But you are not dying for Christ," they said to him, and he said, "No, for the truth." When they came to a place called the Proconsul's Corner, one man cried to him to pray to God for them all, and he blessed the crowd. At the Church of the Baptists they shouted to him, "Save your life," and he answered, "Run for your life from sin." At the Old Market they shouted to him, "Live, live," and he replied, "Save yourselves from hell." At the New Market they yelled, "Repent, repent," and he replied, "Repent of your usury." And on reaching Santa Croce, he saw the monks of his order on the steps, and he reproached them because they did not follow the rule of St. Francis. And some of them shrugged, but others pulled their cowls over their faces to cover them, in shame. And going toward the Justice Gate, many said to him, "Recant. Recant. Don't insist on dying," and he said, "Christ died for us." And they said, "But you are not Christ, you must not die for us." And he said, "But I want to die for him." At the field of justice, one said to him he should do as a certain monk, his superior, had done, abjuring. But Michael answered that he would not abjure, and I saw many in the crowd agree and urge Michael to be strong. So I and many others realized those were his followers, and we moved away from them. Finally we were outside the city, and before us the pyre appeared, the hut, as they called it there, because the wood was arranged in the form of a hut, and there a circle of armed horsemen formed, to keep people from coming too close. And there they bound brother Michael to the stake. And again I heard someone shout to him, "But what is it you're dying for?" And he answered, "For a truth that dwells in me, which I can proclaim only by death." They set fire to the wood. And brother Michael, who had chanted the Credo, afterward chanted the Te Deum. He sang perhaps 8 verses of it, then he bent over as if he had to sneeze, and fell to the ground, because his bonds had burned away. He was already dead. Before the body is completely burned it has already died from the great heat, which makes the heart explode, and from the smoke that fills the chest. Then the hut burned entirely, like a torch, and there was a great glow, and if it had not been for the poor charred body of Michael, still glimpsed among the glowing coals, I would have said I was standing before the burning bush. And I was close enough to have a view. I recalled as I climbed the steps of the library, that made some words rise spontaneously to my lips, about ecstatic rapture. I had read them in the books of St. Hildegard. The flame consists of a splendid clarity, of an unusual vigor, and of an igneous ardor, but possesses the splendid clarity that it may illuminate and the igneous ardor that it may burn. I remembered some words of Ubertino about love. The image of Michael on the pyre became confused with that of Dolcino, and that of Dolcino with that of the beautiful Margaret. I felt again the restlessness that had seized me in church. I tried not to think about it and headed straight for the labyrinth. This was the first time I entered it alone. The long shadows cast by the lamp on the floor terrified me as much as had the visions the previous night. At every moment I feared I would find myself before another mirror, because the magic of mirrors is such that even when you know they are mirrors they still upset you. On the other hand, I did not try to orient myself, or to avoid the room with the perfumes that induce visions. I proceeded as if in the grip of a fever, nor did I know where I wanted to go. In fact, I did not move far from my starting point, because a short time later I found myself again in the heptagonal room by which I had entered. Here, on a table, some books were laid out that I did not seem to have seen the night before. I guessed they were works that Malachi had withdrawn from the scriptorium and had not yet replaced on their proper shelves. I could not comprehend how far I was from the perfume room, because I felt dazed, which could be the effect of some effluvium that reached even that spot, or else of the things I had been pondering until then. I opened a richly illuminated volume that, by its style, seemed to me to come from the monasteries of Ultima Thule. On a page where the Holy Gospel of the Apostle Mark began, I was struck by the image of a lion. I was certain it was a lion, even though I had never seen one in the flesh, and the artist had reproduced its features faithfully, inspired perhaps by the sight of the lions of Hibernia, land of monstrous creatures, and I was convinced that this animal, as for that matter the physiologist says, concentrates in itself all the characteristics of the things at once most horrible and most regal. So that image suggested to me both the image of the enemy and that of Christ our Lord, nor did I know by what symbolic key I was to read it, and I was trembling all over, out of fear and also because of the wind coming through the fissures in the walls. The lion I saw had a mouth bristling with teeth, and a finely armored head like a serpent's. The immense body was supported by 4 paws with sharp, fierce claws, and its coat resembled one of those rugs that later I saw brought from the Orient, with red and emerald scales on which were drawn, yellow as the plague, horrible and sturdy armatures of bone. Also yellow was the tail, which twisted from the rump to the head, ending in a final scroll of black and white tufts. I was already quite awed by the lion, and more than once I had looked around as if I expected to see an animal of that description suddenly appear, when I decided to look at other pages and my eye fell, at the opening of the Gospel of Matthew, on the image of a man. I do not know why, but it frightened me more than the lion. The face was a man's, but this man was sheathed in a kind of stiff chasuble that covered him to his feet, and this chasuble, or cuirass, was encrusted with red and yellow semi-precious stones. The head, which emerged enigmatically from a castle of rubies and topaz, seemed, how blasphemous terror made me, that of the mysterious murderer whose impalpable trail we were following. And then I realized why I linked the animal and the armored man so closely with the labyrinth. Both illustrations, like all in that book, emerged from a pattern of interlocking labyrinths, whose lines of onyx and emerald, threads of chrysoprase, ribbons of beryl seemed all to refer to the tangle of rooms and corridors where I was. My eye became lost, on the page, along gleaming paths, as my feet were becoming lost in the troublous succession of the rooms of the library, and seeing my own wandering depicted on those parchments filled me with uneasiness and convinced me that each of those books was telling, through mysterious concatenations, my present story. De fabula narrator, I said to myself, and I wondered if those pages did not already contain the story of future events in store for me. I opened another book, and this seemed of the Hispanic school. The colors were violent, the red suggested blood or fire. It was the book of Revelation of the Apostle, and once again, as the night before, I happened upon the page of the Muller Amicta Sol. But it was not the same book, the illumination was different. Here the artist had dwelled at greater length on the woman's form. I compared her face, her bosom, her curving thighs with the statue of the Virgin I had seen with Uberdino. The line was different, but this Muller also seemed very beautiful to me. I thought I should not dwell on these notions, and I turned several more pages. I found another woman, but this time it was the whore of Babylon. I was not so much struck by her form as by the thought that she, too, was a woman like the other, and yet this one was the vessel of every vice, whereas the other was the receptacle of every virtue. But the forms were womanly in both cases, and at a certain point I could no longer understand what distinguished them. Again I felt an inner agitation. The image of the Virgin in the church became superimposed on that of the beautiful Margaret. I am damned, I said to myself. Or, I am mad. And I decided I should leave the library. Luckily I was near the staircase. I rushed down, at the risk of stumbling and extinguishing the lamp. I found myself again under the broad vaults of the scriptorium, but I did not linger even there, and hurled myself down the stairs leading to the refectory. Here I paused, gasping. The light of the moon came through the windows, very radiant, and I hardly needed the lamp, which would have been indispensable for cells and for passages of the library. Nevertheless, I kept it burning, as if to seek comfort. But I was still breathless, and I decided I should drink some water to calm my tension. Since the kitchen was near, I crossed the refectory and slowly opened one of the doors that led into the second half of the ground floor of the edificium. And at this point my terror, instead of lessening, increased. Because I immediately realized someone else was in the kitchen, near the bread oven, or at least I realized a light was shining in that corner. Filled with fear, I blew mine out. Frightened as I was, I instilled fright, and in fact the other person, or persons, immediately put out their light, too. But in vain, because the moonlight illuminated the kitchen sufficiently to cast before me one or more confused shadows on the floor. Frozen, I did not dare draw back or advance. I heard a stammering sound, and I thought I heard, softly, a woman's voice. Then from the shapeless group that could be discerned vaguely near the oven, a dark, squat form broke away and fled toward the outside door, evidently left ajar, closing it after himself. I remained, on the threshold between refectory and kitchen, and so did a vague something near the oven. A vague and, how to say it, moaning something. From the shadows, in fact, came a groan, a kind of subdued weeping, rhythmic sobs of fear. Nothing gives a fearful man more courage than another's fear, but it was not fear that impelled me toward the shadow. Rather, I would say, I was driven by an intoxication not unlike the one that had gripped me when I was having visions. In the kitchen there was something kin to the fumes that had overcome me in the library the night before. It was perhaps not the same substance, but on my overexcited senses it had the same effect. I sniffed a pungent smell of tragacanth, alum, and tartar, which cooks use to make wine aromatic. Or perhaps, as I learned later, in those days they were brewing beer, which in that northern part of the peninsula was held in some esteem, and it was prepared with the method of my country, with heather, swamp myrtle, and wild rosemary. All spices that intoxicate more than my nostrils, my mind. And while my rational instinct was to cry out, "Vade retro," and get away from the moaning thing that was certainly a succubus summoned for me by the evil one. Something in my vis appetitiva urged me forward, as if I wanted to take part to some marvel. And so I approached the shadow, until, in the moonlight that fell from the high windows, I realized that it was a woman, trembling, clutching to her breast, one hand holding a package, and drawing back, weeping, toward the mouth of the oven. May God, the Blessed Virgin, and all the saints of paradise assist me in telling what then happened. Modesty, the dignity of my position, as an aged monk by now, in this handsome monastery of Melk, a haven of peace and serene meditation, would counsel me to take the most devout precautions. I should simply say that something evil took place and that it would not be meet to tell what it was, and so I would upset neither my reader nor myself. But I have determined to tell, of those remote events, the whole truth, and truth is indivisible. It shines with its own transparency and does not allow itself to be diminished by our interests or our shame. The problem is, rather, of telling what happened not as I see it now and remember it, even if I still remember everything with pitiless vividness, nor do I know whether my subsequent repentance has so fixed in my memory these situations and thoughts, or whether the inadequacy of that same repentance still torments me, resuscitating in my oppressed mind the smallest details of my shame, but as I saw it and felt it then. And I can do so with the fidelity of a chronicler, for if I close my eyes I can repeat not only everything I did but also what I thought in those moments, as if I were copying a parchment written at the time. I must therefore proceed in this way. Saint Michael Archangel protect me, because for the edification of future readers and the flaying of my guilt I want now to tell how a young man can succumb to the snares of the devil, that they may be known and evident, so anyone encountering them in the future may defeat them. So, it was a woman. Or, rather, a girl. Having had until then, and since then, God be thanked, little intimacy with creatures of that sex, I cannot say what her age may have been. I know she was young, almost adolescent, perhaps she had passed 16 or 18 springs, or perhaps 20, and I was struck by the impression of human reality that emanated from that form. It was not a vision, and in any case it seemed to me Valdibona. Perhaps because she was trembling like a little bird in winter, and was weeping, and was afraid of me. Thinking that the duty of every good Christian is to succor his neighbor, I approached her with great gentleness and in good Latin told her she should not fear, because I was a friend, in any case not an enemy, certainly not the enemy she perhaps dreaded. Because of the meekness of my gaze, I imagine, the creature grew calm and came to me. I sensed that she did not understand my Latin and instinctively I addressed her in my German vernacular, and this frightened her greatly, whether because of the harsh sounds, unfamiliar to the people of those parts, or because those sounds reminded her of some other experience with soldiers from my lands, I cannot say which. Then I smiled, considering that the language of gestures and of the face is more universal than that of words, and she was reassured. She smiled at me, too, and said a few words. I knew her vernacular very slightly. It was different from the bit I had learned in Pisa, but I realized from her tone that she was saying sweet words to me, and she seemed to be saying something like, "You are young, you are handsome." It is rare for a novice who has spent his whole childhood in a monastery to hear declarations of his beauty. Indeed, we are regularly admonished that physical beauty is fleeting and must be considered base. But the snares of the enemy are infinite, and I confess that this reference to my comeliness, though mendacious, fell sweetly on my ears and filled me with an irrepressible emotion. Especially since the girl, in saying this, had extended her hand until the tips of her fingers grazed my cheek, then quite beardless. I felt a kind of delirium, but at that moment I was unable to sense any hint of sin in my heart. Such is the force of the devil when he wants to try us and dispel from our spirit the signs of grace. What did I feel? What did I see? I remember only that the emotions of the first moment were bereft of any expression, because my tongue and my mind had not been instructed in how to name sensations of that sort. Until I recalled other inner words, heard in another time and in other places, spoken certainly for other ends, but which seemed wondrously in keeping with my joy in that moment, as if they had been born consubstantially to express it. Words pressed into the caverns of my memory rose to the dumb surface of my lips, and I forgot that they had served in Scripture or in the pages of the saints to express quite different, more radiant realities. But was there truly a difference between the delights of which the saints had spoken and those that my agitated spirit was feeling at that moment? At that moment the watchful sense of difference was annihilated in me. And this, it seems to me, is precisely the sign of rapture in the abysses of identity. Suddenly the girl appeared to me as the black but comely virgin of whom the Song of Songs speaks. She wore a threadbare little dress of rough cloth that opened in a fairly immodest fashion over her bosom, and around her neck was a necklace made of little colored stones, very commonplace, I believe. But her head rose proudly on a neck as white as an ivory tower, her eyes were clear as the pools of Heshbon, her nose was as the Tower of Lebanon, her hair like purple. Yes, her tresses seemed to me like a flock of goats, her teeth like flocks of sheep coming up from their bath, all in pairs, so that none preceded its companion. And I could not help murmuring, "Behold, thou art fair, my love, behold, thou art fair. Thy hair is as a flock of goats that lie along the side of Mount Gilead. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet, thy temples are like a piece of a pomegranate, thy neck is like the Tower of David whereon there hang 1,000 bucklers." And I asked myself, frightened and rapt, who was she who rose before me like the dawn, beautiful as the moon, radiant as the sun, terribilis ut castorem acies ordinata. Then the creature came still closer to me, throwing into a corner the dark package she had till then held pressed to her bosom. And she raised her hand to stroke my face, and repeated the words I had already heard. And while I did not know whether to flee from her or move even closer, while my head was throbbing as if the trumpets of Joshua were about to bring down the walls of Jericho, as I yearned and at once feared to touch her, she smiled with great joy, emitted the stifled moan of a pleased she-goat, and undid the strings that closed her dress over her bosom, slipped the dress from her body like a tunic, and stood before me as Eve must have appeared to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Pulchra sunt ubera quae paululum supereminent et tument modus, I murmured, repeating the words I had heard from Uberdino, because her breasts appeared to me like two fawns that are twins of a roe, feeding among the lilies. Her navel was a goblet wherein no mingled wine is wanting, her belly a heap of wheat set about with lilies. O situs clarum pellarum, I cried to her, O porta clausa, forts hortorum, sella custos ungentorum, sella pigmentaria. Inadvertently I found myself against her body, feeling its warmth and the sharp perfume of unguents never known before. I remembered, sons, when mad love comes, man is powerless, and I understood that, whether what I felt was a snare of the enemy or a gift of heaven, I was now powerless against the impulse that moved me, and I cried, O langueo, and causam languorus video nec cavio. Also because a rosy perfume breathed from her lips and her feet were beautiful in sandals, and her legs were like columns and jewels were the joints of her thighs, the work of the hands of a cunning workman. O love, daughter of delights, a king is held captive in your tresses, I murmured to myself, and I was in her arms, and we fell together onto the bare floor of the kitchen, and, whether on my own initiative or through her wiles, I found myself free of my novice's habit and we felt no shame at our bodies and cuncta erant bona. And she kissed me with the kisses of her mouth, and her loves were more delicious than wine and her ointments had a goodly fragrance, and her neck was beautiful among pearls and her cheeks among earrings. Behold thou art fair, my beloved, behold thou art fair. Thine eyes are as doves, I said, and let me see thy face, let me hear thy voice, for thy voice is harmonious and thy face enchanting. Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. Thy lips drop as the honeycomb, honey and milk are under thy tongue. The smell of thy breath is of apples. Thy two breasts are clusters of grapes. Thy palate a heady wine that goes straight to my love and mows over my lips and teeth. A fountain sealed, spikenard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, myrrh and aloes. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey, I have drunk my wine with my milk. Who was she who rose like the dawn, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, terrible as an army with banners? O Lord, when the soul is transported, the only virtue lies in loving what you see, is that not true? The supreme happiness in having what you have. Their blissful life is drunk at its source. Has this not been said? There you savor the true life that we will live after this mortal life among the angels for all eternity? This is what I was thinking, and it seemed to me the prophecies were being fulfilled at last, as the girl lavished indescribable sweetness on me, and it was as if my whole body were an eye, before and behind, and I could suddenly see all surrounding things. And I understood that from it, from love, unity and tenderness are created together, as are good and kiss and fulfillment, as I had already heard, believing I was being told about something else. And only for an instant, as my joy was about to reach its zenith, did I remember that perhaps I was experiencing, and at night, the possession of the noontime devil, who was condemned finally to reveal himself in his true, diabolical nature to the soul that in ecstasy asks, Who are you? Who knows how to grip the soul and delude the body? But I was immediately convinced that my scruples were indeed devilish, for nothing could be more right and good and holy than what I was experiencing, the sweetness of which grew with every moment. As a little drop of water added to a quantity of wine is completely dispersed and takes on the color and taste of wine, as red-hot iron becomes like molten fire losing its original form, as air when it is inundated with the sun's light is transformed into total splendor and clarity so that it no longer seems illuminated but, rather, seems to be light itself, so I felt myself die of tender liquefaction, and I had only the strength left to murmur the words of the song. Behold my bosom is like new wine, sealed, which bursts new vessels, and suddenly I saw a brilliant light and in it a saffron-colored form which flamed up in a sweet and shining fire, and that splendid light spread through all the shining fire, and this shining fire through that golden form and that brilliant light and that shining fire through the whole form. As, half fainting, I fell on the body to which I had joined myself, I understood in a last vital spurt that flame consists of a splendid clarity, an unusual vigor, and an igneous ardor, but it possesses the splendid clarity so that it may illuminate and the igneous ardor that it may burn. Then I understood the abyss, and the deeper abysses that it conjured up. Now that, with a hand that trembles, either in horror at the sin I am recounting or in guilty nostalgia of the event I recall, I write these lines, I realize that to describe my wicked ecstasy of that instant I have used the same words that I use, not many pages before, to describe the fire that burned the martyred body of the Fraticello Michael. Nor is it an accident that my hand, passive agent of the soul, has penned the same expression for two experiences so disparate, because probably I experienced them in the same way both at the time, when I lived through them, and now, as I have tried to bring them back to life on this parchment. There is a mysterious wisdom by which phenomena among themselves disparate can be called by analogous names, just as divine things can be designated by terrestrial terms, and through equivocal symbols God can be called lion or leopard, and death can be called sword, joy, flame, flame, death, death, abyss, abyss, perdition, perdition, raving, and raving, passion. Why did one, as a youth, depict the ecstasy of death that had impressed me in the martyr Michael in the words the saint had used for the ecstasy of divine life, and yet I could not refrain from depicting in the same words the ecstasy, culpable and fleeting, of earthly pleasure, which immediately afterward had spontaneously appeared to me as a sensation of death and annihilation? I shall try now to reflect both on the way I felt, a few months apart, two experiences at once uplifting and painful, and on the way in which that night in the Abbey I consciously remembered the one and felt with my senses the other, a few hours apart, and, further, on the way I have relived them now, penning these lines, and on how in all three instances I recited them to myself with the words of the different experience of that sainted soul annihilated in the divine vision. Have I perhaps blasphemed, then? Now? What was similar in Michael's desire for death, in the transport I felt at the sight of the flame consuming him, in the desire for carnal union I felt with the girl, in the mystic shame with which I translated it allegorically, and in the desire for joyous annihilation that moved the saint to die in his own love in order to live longer and eternally? Is it possible that things so equivocal can be said in such a univocal way? And this, it seems, is the teaching left us by St. Thomas, the greatest of all doctors. The more openly it remains a figure of speech, the more it is a dissimilar similitude and not literal, the more a metaphor reveals its truth. But if love of the flame and of the abyss are the metaphor for the love of God, can they be the metaphor for love of death and love of sin? Yes, as the lion and the serpent stand both for Christ and the devil. The fact is that correct interpretation can be established only on the authority of the Fathers, and in the case that torments me, I have no auctoritas to which my obedient mind can refer, and I burn in doubt, and again the image of fire appears to define the void of the truth and the fullness of the error that annihilate me. What is happening, O Lord, in my spirit, now that I allow myself to be gripped by the vortex of memories and I conflagrate different times at once, as if I were to manipulate the order of the stars and the sequence of their celestial movements? Certainly I am overstepping the boundaries of my sinful and sick intelligence. Now, let us return to the task I had humbly set myself. I was telling about that day and the total bewilderment of the senses into which I sank. There, I have told what I remembered on that occasion, and let my feeble pen, faithful and truthful chronicler, stop there. I lay, how long I do not know, the girl at my side. With a light motion her hand continued to touch my body, now damp with sweat. I felt an inner exultation, which was not peace, but like the last subdued flicker of the fire taking time to die beneath the embers, when the flame is already dead. I would not hesitate to call blessed a man to whom it was granted to experience something similar in this life, I murmured as if in my sleep, even rarely, and, in fact, I experienced it only that time, and very rapidly, for the space of a single moment. As if one no longer existed, not feeling one's identity at all, or feeling lowered, almost annihilated. If some mortal, I said to myself, could for a single moment and most rapidly enjoy what I have enjoyed, he would immediately look with a baleful eye at this perverse world, would be upset by the bane of daily life, would feel the weight of the body of death. Was this not what I had been taught? That invitation of my whole spirit to lose all memory and bliss was surely, now I understood it, the radiance of the eternal sun, and the joy that it produces opens, extends, enlarges man, and the gaping chasm man bears within himself is no longer sealed so easily, for it is the wound cut by the blow of love's sword, nor is there anything else here below more sweet and terrible. But such is the ride of the sun. It riddles the wounded man with its rays and all the wounds widen, the man uncloses and extends, his very veins are laid open, his strength is now incapable of obeying the orders it receives and is moved solely by desire, the spirit burns, sunk into the abyss of what it is now touching, seeing its own desire and its own truth outstripped by the reality it has lived and is living. And one witnesses, dumbfounded, one's own raving. And in the grip of these sensations of ineffable inner joy, I dozed off. I reopened my eyes some time later, and the moonlight, perhaps because of a cloud, had grown much fainter. I stretched out my hand at my side and no longer felt the girl's body. I turned my head, she was gone. The absence of the object that had unleashed my desire and slaked my thirst made me realize suddenly both the vanity of that desire and the perversity of that thirst. Omne animal trist post coitum. I became aware that I had sinned. Now, after years and years, while I still bitterly bemoan my error, I cannot forget how that evening I had felt great pleasure, and I would be doing a wrong to the Almighty, who created all things in goodness and beauty, if I did not admit that also between those two sinners something happened that in itself, naturaliter, was good and beautiful. But perhaps it is my present old age, which makes me feel, culpably, how beautiful and good all my youth was just when I should turn my thoughts to death, which is approaching. Then, a young man, I did not think of death, but, hotly and sincerely, I wept for my sin. I stood up, trembling, also because I had lain a long time on the cold stones of the kitchen and my body was numb. I dressed, almost feverish. I glimpsed then in a corner the package that the girl had abandoned in her flight. I bent to examine the object. It was a kind of bundle, a rolled-up cloth that seemed to come from the kitchen. I unwrapped it, and at first I did not understand what was inside, both because of the scant light and because of the shapeless shape of the contents. Then I understood. Among clots of blood and scraps of flabbier and whitish meat, before my eyes, dead but still throbbing with the gelatinous life of dead viscera, lined by livid nerves, a heart of great size. A dark veil descended over my eyes, and acid saliva rose in my mouth. I let out a cry and fell as a dead body falls. Night. In which Adza, distraught, confesses to William and meditates on the function of woman in the plan of creation, but then he discovers the corpse of a man. I came around to find someone bathing my face. There, holding a lamp, was Brother William, who had put something under my head. "What's happened, Adza?" he asked me. "Have you been roaming about at night stealing offal from the kitchen?" In short, William had awakened, sought me for I forget what reason, and, not finding me, suspected me of going to perform some bit of bravado in the library. Approaching the edificium on the kitchen side, he saw a shadow slip from the door toward the vegetable garden. It was the girl, leaving, perhaps because she had heard someone approaching. He tried to figure out who it was and follow her, but she, or rather, the shadow, as she was for him, went toward the outside wall of the compound and disappeared. Then William, after an exploration of the environs, entered the kitchen and found me lying in a faint. When, still terrified, I mentioned to him the package with the heart, blurting out something about another crime, he started laughing. "Adza, what man could have such a big heart? It's the heart of a cow, or an ox. They slaughtered an animal today, in fact. But tell me, how did it come into your hands?" At that point, overwhelmed with remorse, and still stunned by my great fear, I burst into a flood of tears and asked him to administer to me the sacrament of confession. Which he did, and I told him all, concealing nothing. Brother William heard me out earnestly, but with a hint of indulgence. When I had finished, his face turned grave and he said, "Adza, you have sinned, that is certain, against the commandment that bids you not to fornicate, and also against your duties as a novice. In your defense there is the fact that you found yourself in one of those situations in which even a father in the desert would have damned himself. And of woman as source of temptation the scriptures have already said enough. Ecclesiastes says of woman that her conversation is like burning fire, and the Proverbs say that she takes possession of man's precious soul and the strongest men are ruined by her. And Ecclesiastes further says, and I find more bitter than death the woman, whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. And others have said she is the vessel of the devil. Having affirmed this, dear Adza, I cannot convince myself that God chose to introduce such a foul being into creation without also endowing it with some virtues. And I cannot help reflecting that he granted her many privileges and motives of prestige, 3 of them very great indeed. In fact, he created man in this base world, and from mud, woman he created later, in paradise and of noble human matter. And he did not mold her from Adam's feet or his viscera, but from the rib. In the second place, the Lord, who is all-powerful, could have become incarnate as a man directly in some miraculous way, but he chose instead to dwell in the womb of a woman, a sign that it was not so foul after all. And when he appeared after the resurrection, he appeared to a woman. And finally, in the celestial glory no man shall be king of that realm, but the queen will be a woman who has never sinned. If, then, the Lord showed such favor to Eve herself and to her daughters, is it so abnormal that we also should feel drawn by the graces and the nobility of that sex? What I mean to say to you, Adza, is that you must not do it again, of course, but it is not so monstrous that you were tempted to do it. And as far as that goes, for a monk to have, at least once in his life, experience of carnal passion, so that he can one day be indulgent and understanding with the sinners he will counsel and console, well, dear Adza, it is not a thing to be wished before it happens, but it is not something to vituperate too much once it has happened. So go with God and let us speak of it no more. Indeed, rather than reflect and dwell too much on something best forgotten, if possible, and it seemed to me at this point that his voice faded as if at some private emotion, let us ask ourselves the meaning of what happened this night. Who was this girl and whom was she meeting? This I don't know, and I didn't see the man who was with her, I said. Very well, but we can deduce who it was from many and certain clues. First of all, the man was old and ugly, one with whom a girl does not go willingly, especially if she is beautiful, as you say, though it seems to me, my dear wolf cub, that you were prepared to find any food delicious. Why old and ugly? Because the girl didn't go with him for love, but for a pack of scraps. Certainly she is a girl from the village who, perhaps not for the first time, grants her favors to some lustful monk out of hunger, and receives as recompense something for her and her family to eat. A harlot, I said, horrified, a poor peasant girl, Adza, probably with smaller brothers to feed, who, if she were able, would give herself for love and not for lucre. As she did last night. In fact, you tell me she found you young and handsome, and gave you gratis and out of love what to others she would have given for an ox heart and some bits of lung. And she felt so virtuous for the free gift she made of herself, and so uplifted, that she ran off without taking anything in exchange. This is why I think the other one, to whom she compared you, was neither young nor handsome. I confess that, profound as my repentance was, that explanation filled me with a sweet pride, but I kept silent and allowed my master to continue. This ugly old man must have the opportunity to go down to the village and deal with the peasants, for some purpose connected with his position. He must know how to get people into the abbey and out of it, and know there would be that offal in the kitchen. Perhaps tomorrow it would be said that the door had been left open and a dog had come in and eaten the scraps. And, finally, he must have had a certain sense of economy, and a certain interest in seeing that the kitchen was not deprived of more precious victuals. Otherwise he would have given her a steak or some choice cut. And so you see that the picture of our stranger is drawn very clearly, and that all these properties, or accidents, are suited to a substance that I would have no fear in defining as our cellarer, Remigio of Verigine. Or, if I am mistaken, our mysterious Salvatore, who, for that matter, since he comes from these parts, can speak easily with the local people and would know how to persuade a girl to do what he would have made her do, if you had not arrived. That is certainly all correct, I said, convinced, but what is the good of knowing it now? None. Or much, William said. The story may or may not have a connection with the crimes that concern us. On the other hand, if the cellarer was a Dulcinian, that would explain this, and vice versa. And we now know, finally, that this abbey is a place of many, bizarre events at night. And who can say that our cellarer and Salvatore, who move through it in darkness with such ease, do not know, in any event, more things than what they tell? But will they tell them to us? No, not if we behave in a compassionate manner, ignoring their sins. But if we were really to know something, we would possess a way of persuading them to speak. In other words, if there is need, the cellarer and Salvatore are ours, and may God forgive us this deception, since he forgives so many other things, he said, looking at me slyly. I did not have the heart to make any comment on the licitness of these notions of his. And now we should go to bed, because in an hour it is matins. But I see you are still agitated, my poor Adza, still fearful because of your sin. There is nothing like a good spell in church to calm the spirit. I have absolved you, but one never knows. Go and ask the Lord's confirmation. And he gave me a rather brisk slap on the head, perhaps as a show of paternal and virile affection, perhaps as an indulgent penance. Or perhaps, as I culpably thought at that moment, in a sort of good-natured envy, since he was a man who so thirsted for new and vital experiences. We headed for the church, taking our usual path, which I followed in haste, closing my eyes, because all those bones reminded me too obviously, that night, of how I was dust and how foolish had been the pride of my flesh. When we reached the nave we saw a shadowy figure before the main altar. I thought it was again Uberdino, but it was Alenardo, who did not recognize us at first. He said he was unable to sleep and had decided to spend the night praying for that young monk who had disappeared. He could not even remember the name. He prayed for his soul, if he were dead, and for his body, if he were lying ill and alone somewhere. Too many dead, he said, too many dead. But it was written in the book of the apostle. With the first trumpet came the hail, with the second a third part of the sea became blood. And you found one body in the hail, the other in blood. The third trumpet warns that a burning star will fall in the third part of rivers and fountains of waters. So I tell you, our third brother has disappeared. And fear for the fourth, because the third part of the sun will be smitten, and of the moon and the stars, so there will be almost complete darkness. As we came out of the transept, William asked himself whether there were not some element of truth in the old man's words. But, I pointed out to him, this would mean assuming that a single diabolical mind, using the apocalypse as guide, had arranged the three disappearances, also assuming that Berengar is dead. But, on the contrary, we know Adelmo died of his own volition. True, William said, but the same diabolical or sick mind could have been inspired by Adelmo's death to arrange the other two in a symbolic way. And if this were so, Berengar should be found in a river or a fountain. And there are no rivers or fountains in the abbey, at least not such as someone could drown or be drowned in. There are only the baths, I observed, almost by chance. Adza, William said, you know, that could be an idea? The balneary. But they must have looked there. I saw the servants this morning when they were making the search. They opened the door of the balneary and took a glance inside, without investigating. They did not expect to find something carefully hidden. They were looking for a corpse lying somewhere theatrically, like Venantius's body in the jar. Let's go and have a look. It is still dark anyway, and our lamp seems to go on burning merrily. So we did, and without difficulty we opened the door of the balneary, next to the infirmary. Separated one from the other by thick curtains were some tubs, I don't recall how many. The monks used them for their ablutions, on the days the rule established, and Severinus used them for therapeutic reasons, because nothing can restore body and mind better than a bath. A fireplace in one corner allowed the water to be heated easily. We found it dirty with fresh ashes, and before it a great cauldron lay, overturned. The water could be drawn from a font in another corner. We looked in the first tubs, which were empty. Only the last, concealed by a drawn curtain, was full, and next to it lay a garment, in a heap. At first sight, in the beam of our lamp, the surface of the liquid seemed smooth, but as the light struck it we glimpsed on the bottom, lifeless, a naked human body. We pulled it out slowly. Berengar. And this one, William said, truly had the face of a drowned man. The features were swollen. The body, white and flabby, without hair, seemed a woman's except for the obscene spectacle of the flaccid pudenda. I blushed, then shuddered. I made the sign of the cross as William blessed the corpse. Fourth day. Lauds. In which William and Severinus examined Berengar's corpse and discovered that the tongue is black, unusual in a drowned man. Then they discuss most painful poisons in a past theft. I will not go into how we informed the abbot, how the whole abbey woke before the canonical hour, the cries of horror, the fear and grief that could be seen on every face, and how the news spread to all the people of the compound, the servants blessing themselves and uttering formulas against the evil eye. I don't know whether the first office that morning proceeded according to regulations, or who took part in it. I followed William and Severinus, who had Berengar's body wrapped up and ordered it laid out on a table in the infirmary. When the abbot and the other monks had left, the herbalist and my master studied the corpse at length, with the cold detachment of men of medicine. He died by drowning, Severinus said, there's no doubt. The face is swollen, the belly taut. But he was not drowned by another's hands, William observed, for in that case he would have reacted against the murderer's violence, whereas everything was neat and clean, as if Berengar had heated the water, filled the bath, and lain in it of his own free will. This doesn't surprise me, Severinus said. Berengar suffered from convulsions, and I myself had often told him that warm baths served to calm agitation of the body and the spirit. On several occasions he asked me leave to light the balneary fire. So he may have done last night. Night before last, William said, because this body, as you see, has remained in the water at least one day. William informed him of some of the events of that night. He did not tell him we had been in the scriptorium furtively, but, concealing various circumstances, he told him that we had pursued a mysterious figure who had taken a book from us. Severinus realized William was telling him only a part of the truth, but he asked no further questions. He observed that the agitation of Berengar, if he had been the mysterious thief, could have led him then to seek calm in a refreshing bath. Berengar, he said, was of a very sensitive nature, and sometimes a vexation or an emotion brought on his trembling and cold sweats and made his eyes bulge, and he would fall to the ground, spitting out a whitish slime. In any case, William said, before coming here he went somewhere else, because in the balneary I didn't see the book he stole. So he had been somewhere else, and afterward, we'll assume that, to calm his emotion and perhaps to elude our search, he slipped into the balneary and immersed himself in the water. Severinus, do you believe his illness could make him lose consciousness and drown? That's possible, Severinus said, dubiously. For some moments he had been examining the hands of the corpse. Here's a curious thing, he said. What? The other day I observed Venantius's hands, when the blood had been washed off, and I noticed a detail to which I attached little importance. The tips of 2 fingers of Venantius's right hand were dark, as if blackened by some dark substance. Exactly, you see, like 2 fingertips of Berengar now. In fact, here we have a trace also on the 3rd finger. At the time I thought that Venantius had handled some inks in the scriptorium. Interesting, William said pensively, taking a closer look at Berengar's fingers. Dawn was breaking, the light indoors was still faint, and my master was obviously suffering the lack of his lenses. Interesting, he repeated, but there are fainter traces also on the left hand, at least on the thumb and index. If it were only the right hand, they would be the fingers of someone who grasps something small, or long and thin. Like a stylus, or some food, or an insect, or a serpent, or a monstrance, or a stick, too many things. But if there are signs also on the other hand, it could also be a goblet. The right hand holds it firmly and the left helps, exerting less strength. Severinus was now gently rubbing the dead man's fingers, but the dark color did not disappear. I noticed he had put on a pair of gloves, which he probably used when he handled poisonous substances. He sniffed, but without receiving any sensation. I could cite for you many vegetable, and also mineral, substances that leave traces of this sort. Some lethal, others not. The illuminators sometimes have gold dust on their fingers. Adelmo was an illuminator, William said. I imagine that, shattered as his body was, you didn't think of examining the fingers. But these others may have touched something that had belonged to Adelmo. I really don't know, Severinus said. 2 dead men, both with blackened fingers. What do you deduce from that? I deduce nothing. Nihil sequitur geminis ex particularibus unquam. Both cases would have to conform to a rule. For example, a substance exists that blackens the fingers of those who touch it. Triumphantly, I completed the syllogism. Venantius and Berengar have blackened fingers, ergo they touched this substance. Good, Adza, William said, a pity that your syllogism is not valid, because aut semel aut iterum medium generaliter esto, and in this syllogism the middle term never appears as general. A sign that we haven't chosen the major premise well. I shouldn't have said that all those who touch a certain substance have black fingers, because there could also be people with black fingers who have not touched the substance. I should have said that all those and only all those who have black fingers have certainly touched a given substance. Venantius and Berengar, etc. With which we would have a dari, an excellent 3rd mode of the first syllogistic figure. Then we have the answer, I said, delighted. Alas, Adza, you have too much faith in syllogisms. What we have, once again, is simply the question. That is, we have ventured the hypothesis that Venantius and Berengar touched the same thing, an unquestionably reasonable hypothesis. But when we have imagined a substance that, alone among all substances, causes this result, which is still to be established, we still don't know what it is or where they found it, or why they touched it. And, mind you, we don't even know if it's the substance they touched that brought them to their death. Imagine a madman who wants to kill all those who touch gold dust. Would we say it's gold dust that kills? I was upset. I had always believed logic was a universal weapon, and now I realized how its validity depended on the way it was employed. Further, since I had been with my master I had become aware, and was to become even more aware in the days that followed, that logic could be especially useful when you entered it but then left it. Severinus, who was surely not a logician, was meanwhile reflecting on the basis of his own experience. The universe of poisons is various as the mysteries of nature are various, he said. He pointed to a series of pots and ampules, which we had already admired, neatly arranged on shelves along the walls, together with many volumes. As I told you before, many of these herbs, duly compounded and administered in the proper dosage, could be used for lethal beverages and ointments. Over there, Datura stramonium, belladonna, hemlock. They can bring on drowsiness, stimulation, or both. Taken with due care they are excellent medicines, but in excess doses they bring on death. But none of these substances would leave marks on the fingers? None, I believe. Then there are substances that become dangerous only if ingested, whereas others act instead on the skin. And hellebore can cause vomiting in a person who grasps it to uproot it. Dittany and froscinella, when in flower, bring on intoxication in gardeners who touch them, as if the gardeners had drunk wine. Black hellebore, merely at the touch, provokes diarrhea. Other plants cause palpitations of the heart, others of the head, still others silence the voice. But viper's venom, applied to the skin and not allowed to enter the blood, produces only a slight irritation. And once I was shown a compound that, when applied to the inside of a dog's thighs, near the genitalia, causes the animal to die in a short time in horrible convulsions, as the limbs gradually grow rigid. You know many things about poisons, William said with what sounded like admiration in his voice. Severinus looked hard into his eyes for a few moments. I know what a physician, an herbalist, a student of the sciences of human health must know. William remained thoughtful for some time. Then he asked Severinus to open the corpse's mouth and observe the tongue. Severinus, his curiosity aroused, took a thin spatula, one of the instruments of his medical art, and obeyed. He uttered a cry of amazement. The tongue is black. So, then, William murmured, he grasped something with his fingers and ingested it. This eliminates the poisons you mentioned before, which kill by penetrating the skin. But it doesn't make our deductions any easier. Because now, for him and for Venantius, we must presume a voluntary act. They rasped something and put it in their mouths, knowing what they were doing. Something to eat? To drink? Perhaps. Or perhaps, why not, a musical instrument, like a flute? Absurd, Severinus said. Of course it's absurd. But we mustn't dismiss any hypothesis, no matter how far-fetched. Now let's return to the poisonous substance. If someone who knows poisons as you do had broken in here and had used some of these herbs of yours, could he have produced a lethal ointment capable of causing those marks on the fingers and the tongue? Capable of being mixed with food or drink, smeared on a spoon, on something that is put in the mouth? Yes, Severinus admitted, but who? And besides, even if we accept this hypothesis, how would he have administered the poison to our two poor brothers? Frankly, I myself couldn't imagine Venantius or Berengar letting himself be approached by someone who handed him a mysterious substance and being persuaded to eat it or drink it. But William did not seem upset by this unlikelihood. We will think about that later, he said, because now I would like you to try to remember some event that perhaps you haven't recalled before. Someone who asked you questions about your herbs, for instance, someone who has easy access to the infirmary. Just a moment, Severinus said. A long time ago, years it was, on one of those shelves I kept a highly powerful substance, given to me by a brother who had traveled in distant lands. He couldn't tell me what it was made of, herbs for sure, but not all of them familiar. To look at, it was slimy and yellowish, but I was advised not to touch it, because if it only came into contact with my lips it would kill me in a short time. The brother told me that, when ingested even in minimal doses, in the space of a half hour it caused a feeling of great weariness, then a slow paralysis of all the limbs, and finally death. He didn't want to carry it with him, and so he presented it to me. I kept it for a long time, because I meant to examine it somehow. Then one day there was a great storm up here. One of my assistants, a novice, had left the infirmary door open, and the hurricane wrought havoc in this room where we are now. Bottles broken, liquids spilled on the floor, herbs and powders scattered. I worked a whole day putting my things back in order, and I accepted help only in sweeping away the broken vessels and the herbs that could not be recovered. At the end I realized that the very ampule I mentioned to you was missing. At first I was worried, then I decided it had been broken and become confused with the other rubbish. I had the infirmary floor washed carefully, and the shelves. And you had seen the ampule a few hours before the storm? Yes, or, rather, no, now that I think about it. It was behind a row of pots, carefully hidden, and I didn't check it every day. Therefore, as far as you know, it could have been stolen quite a while before the storm, without your finding out? Now that I think about it, yes, unquestionably. And that novice of yours could have stolen it and, then could have seized the occasion of the storm deliberately to leave the door open and create confusion among your things? Severinus seemed very excited. Yes, of course. Not only that, but as I recall what happened, I was quite surprised that the hurricane, violent though it was, had upset so many things. It could quite well be that someone took advantage of the storm to devastate the room and produce more damage than the wind could have done. Who was the novice? His name was Augustine, but he died last year, a fall from scaffolding as he and other monks and servants were cleaning the sculptures of the facade of the church. Actually, now that I think about it, he swore up and down that he had not left the door open before the storm. I was the one, in my fury, who held him responsible for the accident. Perhaps he really was not guilty. And so we have a third person, perhaps far more expert than a novice, who knew about your rare poison. Whom had you told about it? That I really don't remember. The abbot, of course, to ask his permission to keep such a dangerous substance. And a few others, perhaps in the library, because I was looking for some herbaria that might give me information. But didn't you tell me you keep here the books that are most useful to your art? Yes, and many of them, he said, pointing to a corner of the room where some shelves held dozens of volumes. But then I was looking for certain books I couldn't keep here, which Malachi actually was very reluctant to let me see. In fact, I had to ask the abbot's authorization. His voice sank, and he was almost shy about letting me hear his words. You know, in a secret part of the library, they keep books on necromancy, black magic, and recipes for diabolical filters. I was allowed to consult some of these works, of necessity, and I was hoping to find a description of that poison and its functions. In vain. So you spoke about it with Malachi. Of course, with him definitely, and perhaps also with Berengar, who was his assistant. But you mustn't jump to conclusions. I don't remember clearly, perhaps other monks were present as I was talking. The scriptorium at times is fairly crowded, you know. I'm not suspecting anyone. I'm only trying to understand what can have happened. In any event, you tell me this took place some years ago, and it's odd that anyone would steal a poison and then not use it until so much later. It would suggest a malignant mind brooding for a long time in darkness over a murderous plan. Severinus blessed himself, an expression of horror on his face. God forgive us all, he said. There was no further comment to be made. We again covered Berengar's body, which had to be prepared for the funeral. Prime. In which William induces first Salvador and then the cellarer to confess their past. Severinus finds the stolen lenses. Nicholas brings the new ones, and William, now with 6 eyes, goes to decipher the manuscript of Venantius. We were coming out as Malachi entered. He seemed very annoyed to find us there and started to leave again. From inside, Severinus saw him and said, "Were you looking for me?" "Is it for?" He broke off, glancing at us. Malachi signaled to him, imperceptibly, as if to say, "We'll talk about it later." We were going out as he was entering, and so all 3 of us were to the doorway. Malachi said, somewhat redundantly, "I was looking for the brother herbalist." I have a headache. "It must be the enclosed air of the library," William said to him, in a tone of considerate sympathy. "You should inhale something." Malachi's lips twitched as if he wanted to speak again, but then he gave up the idea, bowed his head, and went on inside, as we moved off. "What is he seeing Severinus for?" I asked. "Adza," my master said to me impatiently, "learn to use your head and think." Then he changed the subject. "We must question some people now. At least," he added, as his eyes explored the grounds, "while they're still alive. By the way, from now on we must be careful about what we eat and drink. Always take your food from the common plate, and your beverage from the pitcher the others have filled their cups from. After Berengar we are the ones who know most. Except, naturally, the murderer. But whom do you want to question now?" "Adza," William said, "you will have observed that here the most interesting things happen at night. They die at night, they wander about the scriptorium at night, women are brought at night into the abbey. We have a daytime abbey and a nighttime abbey, and the nighttime one seems, unhappily, the more interesting. So, every person who roams about at night interests us, including, for example, the man you saw last night with the girl. Perhaps the business of the girl does not have anything to do with the poisonings, and perhaps it has. In any case, I have my ideas about last night's man, and he must be one who knows other things about the nocturnal life of this holy place. And, speak of the devil, here he is, coming this way." He pointed to Salvador, who had also seen us. I noticed a slight hesitation in his step, as if, wishing to avoid us, he was about to turn around. But it was only for a moment. Obviously, he realized he couldn't escape the meeting, and he continued toward us. He greeted us with a broad smile and a fairly unctuous benedicite. My master hardly allowed him to finish and spoke to him sharply. "You know the Inquisition arrives here tomorrow?" he asked him. Salvador didn't seem pleased with this news. In a faint voice, he asked, "And me? And you would be wise to tell the truth to me, your friend and a friar minor as you once were, rather than have to tell it tomorrow to those whom you know quite well." Attacked so brusquely, Salvador seemed to abandon all resistance. With a meek air he looked at William, as if to indicate he was ready to tell whatever he was asked. "Last night there was a woman in the kitchen. Who was with her?" "Oh, a female who sells herself like Mercandia cannot be bona or have cortesia," Salvador recited. "I don't want to know whether the girl is pure. I want to know who was with her. These evil females are all clever. They think de noche about how to trap a man." William seized him roughly by the chest. "Who was with her, you or the cellarer?" Salvador realized he couldn't go on lying. He began to tell a strange story, from which, with great effort, we learned that, to please the cellarer, he procured girls for him in the village, introducing them within the walls at night by paths he would not reveal to us. But he swore he acted out of the sheer goodness of his heart, betraying a comic regret that he could not find a way to enjoy his own pleasure and see that the girl, having satisfied the cellarer, would give something also to him. He said all this with slimy, lubricious smiles and winks, as if to suggest he was speaking to men made of flesh, accustomed to such practices. He stole glances at me, nor could I check him as I would have liked, because I felt myself bound to him by a common secret, his accomplice and companion in sin. At this point William decided to stake everything. He asked Salvatore abruptly, "Did you know Remigio before or after you were with Dulcino?" Salvatore knelt at his feet, begging him, between sobs, not to destroy him, to save him from the Inquisition. William solemnly swore not to tell anyone what he would learn, and Salvatore did not hesitate to deliver the cellarer into our hands. The two men had met on Bald Mountain, both in Dulcino's band. Salvatore and the cellarer had fled together and had entered the convent of Casali, and, still together, they had joined the Cluniacs. As he stammered out pleas for forgiveness, it was clear there was nothing further to be learned from him. William decided it was worth taking Remigio by surprise, and he left Salvatore, who ran to seek refuge in the church. The cellarer was on the opposite side of the abbey, in front of the granaries, bargaining with some peasants from the valley. He looked at us apprehensively and tried to act very busy, but William insisted on speaking with him. "For reasons connected with your position, you are obviously forced to move about the abbey even when the others are asleep, I imagine," William said. "That depends," Remigio answered. "Sometimes there are little matters to deal with, and I have to sacrifice a few hours' sleep." "Has nothing happened to you, in these cases, that might indicate there is someone else roaming about, without your justification, between the kitchen and the library?" "If I had seen anything, I would have told the abbot." "Of course," William agreed, and abruptly changed the subject. "The village down below is not very rich, is it?" "Yes and no," Remigio answered. "Some prebenders live there, abbey dependents, and they share our wealth in the good years. For example, on St. John's Day they received 12 bushels of malt, a horse, 7 oxen, a bull, 4 heifers, 5 calves, 20 sheep, 15 pigs, 50 chickens, and 17 hives. Also 20 smoked pigs, 27 tubs of lard, half a measure of honey, 3 measures of soap, a fishnet." I understand, William interrupted him. "But you must admit that this still tells me nothing of the situation of the village, how many among its inhabitants have prebends, and how much land those who are not prebendaries possess to cultivate on their own." "Oh, as far as that goes," Remigio said, "a normal family down there has as much as 50 tablets of land." "How much is a tablet?" 4 square trabucci, of course." "Square trabucci? How much are they?" 36 square feet is a square trabucco. Or, if you prefer, 800 linear trabucci make a Piedmont mile. And calculate that a family, in the lands to the north, can cultivate olives for at least half a sack of oil. Half a sack? Yes, 1 sack makes 5 amine, and 1 emina makes 8 cups. "I see," my master said, disheartened. "Every locality has its own measures. Do you measure wine, for example, by the tankard? Or by the rubio? 6 rubi make 1 brenta, and 8 brente, a keg. If you like, 1 rubio is 6 pints from 2 tankards." "I believe my ideas are clear now," William said, resigned. "Do you wish to know anything else?" Remigio asked, with a tone that to me seemed defiant. "Yes, I was asking you about how they live in the valley, because today in the library I was meditating on the sermons to women by Humbert of Romans, and in particular on that chapter, Ad Mulieres Paupers in Vililis, in which he says that they, more than others, are tempted to sins of the flesh because of their poverty, and wisely he says that they commit mortal sin when they sin with a layman, but the mortality of the sin becomes greater when it is committed with a priest, and greatest of all when the sin is with a monk, who is dead to the world. You know better than I that even in holy places such as abbeys the temptations of the noontime devil are never wanting. I was wondering whether in our contacts with the people of the village you had heard that some monks, God forbid, had induced maidens into fornication." Although my master said these things in an almost absent tone, my reader can imagine how the words upset the poor cellarer. I cannot say he blanched, but I will say that I was so expecting him to turn pale that I saw him look whiter. "You ask me about things that I would already have told the abbot if I knew them," he answered humbly. "In any case, if, as I imagine, this information serves for your investigation, I will not keep silent about anything I may learn. Indeed, now that you remind me, with regard to your first question. The night poor Adelmo died, I was stirring about the yard, a question of the hens, you know. I had heard rumors that one of the blacksmiths was stealing from the chicken coops at night. Yes, that night I did happen to see, from the distance, I couldn't swear to it, Berengar going back into the dormitory, moving along the choir, as if he had come from the edificium. I wasn't surprised. There had been whispering about Berengar among the monks for some time. Perhaps you've heard? No, tell me. Well, how can I say it? Berengar was suspected of harboring passions that are not proper for a monk. Are you perhaps trying to tell me he had relations with village girls, as I was asking you?" The cellarer coughed, embarrassed, and flashed a somewhat obscene smile. "Oh, no, even less proper passions. Then a monk who enjoys carnal satisfaction with a village maid is indulging in passions, on the other hand, that are somehow proper. I didn't say that, but you'll agree that there is a hierarchy of depravity as there is of virtue. The flesh can be tempted according to nature and against nature. You're telling me that Berengar was impelled by carnal desires for those of his own sex? I'm saying that such were the whisperings. I'm informing you of these things as proof of my sincerity and my goodwill. And I thank you. And I agree with you that the sin of sodomy is far worse than other forms of lust, which, frankly, I am not inclined to investigate. Sad, wretched things, even if they prove to have taken place, the cellarer said philosophically. Yes, Remigio. We are all wretched sinners. I would never seek the mote in a brother's eye, since I am so afraid of having a great beam in my own. But I will be grateful to you for any beams you may mention to me in the future. So we will talk great, sturdy trunks of wood and we will allow the motes to swirl in the air. How much did you say a square trabuco was? 36 square feet, but you mustn't waste your time. When you wish to know something specific, come to me. Consider me a faithful friend. I do consider you as such, William said warmly. Ubertino told me that you once belonged to my own order. I would never betray a former brother, especially in these days when we are awaiting the arrival of the papal legation led by a grand inquisitor, famous for having burned many Dulcinians. You said a square trabuco equals 36 square feet? The cellarer was no fool. He decided it was no longer worthwhile playing at cat and mouse, particularly since he realized he was the mouse. Brother William, he said, I see you know many more things than I imagined. Help me and I'll help you. It's true, I am a poor man of flesh, and I succumb to the lures of the flesh. Salvatore told me that you or your novice caught them last night in the kitchen. You have traveled widely, William. You know that not even the cardinals in Avignon are models of virtue. I know you are not questioning me because of these wretched little sins. But I also realize you have learned something of my past. I have had a strange life, like many of us minorites. Years ago I believed in the ideal of poverty, and I abandoned the community to live as a vagabond. I believed in Dolcino's preaching, as many others like me did. I'm not an educated man. I've been ordained, but I can barely say Mass. I know little of theology. And perhaps I'm not really moved by ideas. You see, I once tried to rebel against the overlords. Now I serve them, and for the sake of the Lord of these lands I give orders to men like myself. Betray or rebel. We simple folk have little choice. Sometimes the simple understand things better than the learned, William said. Perhaps, the cellarer said with a shrug. But I don't even know why I did what I did, then. You see, for Salvatore it was comprehensible. His parents were serfs, he came from a childhood of hardship and illness. Dolcino represented rebellion, the destruction of the lords. For me it was different. I came from a city family, I wasn't running away from hunger. It was, I don't know how to say it, a feast of fools, a magnificent carnival. On the mountains with Dolcino, before we were reduced to eating the flesh of our companions killed in battle, before so many died of hardship that we couldn't eat them all, and they were thrown to the birds and the wild animals on the slopes of Rebello. Or maybe in those moments, too, there was an atmosphere, can I say of freedom? I didn't know, before, what freedom was. The preachers said to us, the truth will make you free. We felt free, we thought that was the truth. We thought everything we were doing was right. And there you took, to uniting yourself freely with women? I asked, and I don't even know why, but since the night before, Ubertino's words had been haunting me, along with what I had read in the scriptorium and the events that had befallen me. William looked at me, curious. He had probably not expected me to be so bold and outspoken. The cellarer stared at me as if I were a strange animal. On Rebello, he said, there were people who throughout their childhood had slept, 10 or more of them, in a room of a few cubits, brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters. What do you think this new situation meant to them? They did from choice what they had formerly done from necessity. And then, at night, when you fear the arrival of the enemy troops and you cling tight to your neighbor, on the ground, so as not to feel cold. The heretics. You pitiful monks who come from a castle and end up in an abbey think that it's a form of belief, inspired by the devil. But it's a way of living, and it was, a new experience. There were no more masters, and God, we were told, was with us. I'm not saying we were right, William, and, in fact, you find me here because I abandoned them before long. But I never really understood our learned disputes about the poverty of Christ and ownership and rights. I told you, it was a great carnival, and in carnival time everything is done backward. As you grow old, you grow not wise but greedy. And here I am, a glutton. You can condemn a heretic to death, but would you condemn a glutton? That's enough, Remigio, William said. I'm not questioning you about what happened then, but about what happened recently. Be frank with me, and I will surely not seek your downfall. I cannot and would not judge you. But you must tell me what you know about events in the abbey. You move about too much, night and day, not to know something. Who killed Venantius? I do not know, I give you my solemn oath. I know when he died, and where. When? Where? I'll tell you. That night, an hour after Compline, I went into the kitchen. How did you enter, and for what reasons? By the door from the vegetable garden. I have a key I had the smiths make for me long ago. The kitchen door is the only one not barred on the inside. And my reasons are not important. You said yourself you don't want to condemn me for my weaknesses of the flesh. He smiled, embarrassed. But I wouldn't want you to believe I spend my days in fornication, either. That night I was looking for food to give to the girls Salvatore was to bring into the kitchen. Where from? Oh, the outside walls have other entrances besides the gate. The abbot knows them, I know them. But that evening the girl didn't come in. I sent her back precisely because of what I discovered, what I'm about to tell you. This is why I tried to have her return last night. If you'd arrived a bit later you would have found me instead of Salvatore. It was he who warned me there were people in the edificium. So I went back to my cell. Let's return to the night between Sunday and Monday. Yes, then. I entered the kitchen, and on the floor I saw Venantius, dead. In the kitchen? Yes, near the sink. Perhaps he had just come down from the scriptorium. No sign of a struggle? None. Though there was a broken cup beside the body, and traces of water on the ground. How do you know it was water? I don't know. I thought it was water. What else might it have been? As William pointed out to me later, that cup could mean two different things. Either someone had given Venantius a poisoned potion to drink right there in the kitchen, or else the poor youth had already taken the poison. But where? And when? And had come down to drink, to soothe a sudden burning, a spasm, a pain that seared his viscera or his tongue. For certainly his must have been black like Berengar's. In any case, we could learn no more for the moment. Having glanced at the corpse, terrified, Remigio asked himself what he should do and decided he would do nothing. If he sought help, he would have to admit he had been wandering around the edificium at night, nor would it do his now lost brother any good. Therefore, he resolved to leave things as they were, waiting for someone else to discover the body in the morning when the doors were opened. He rushed to head off Salvatore, who was already bringing the girl into the abbey. Then he and his accomplice went off to sleep, if their agitated vigil till matins could be called that. And at matins, when the swineherds brought the news to the abbot, Remigio believed the body had been discovered where he had left it, and was aghast to find it in the jar. Who had spirited the corpse out of the kitchen? For this Remigio had no explanation. The only one who can move freely about the edificium is Malachi, William said. The cellarer reacted violently. No, not Malachi. That is, I don't believe. In any case, I didn't say anything to you against Malachi. Rest assured, whatever your debt to Malachi may be. Does he know something about you? Yes. The cellarer blushed. And he has behaved like a man of discretion. If I were you, I would keep an eye on Benno. He had strange connections with Berengar and Venantius. But I swear to you, I've seen nothing else. If I learn something, I'll tell you. For the present this will do. I'll seek you out again if I need you. The cellarer, obviously relieved, returned to his dealings, sharply reproaching the peasants, who in the meantime had apparently shifted some sacks of seeds. At that point Severinus joined us. In his hand he was carrying William's lenses, the ones stolen 2 nights before. I found them inside Berengar's habit, he said. I saw them on your nose the other day in the scriptorium. They're yours, aren't they? God be praised, William cried joyously. We've solved 2 problems. I have my lenses and I finally know for sure that it was Berengar who robbed us the other night in the scriptorium. We had barely finished speaking when Nicholas of Morimondo came running up, even more triumphant than William. In his hands he held a finished pair of lenses, mounted on their fork. William, he cried, I did it all by myself. I've finished them. I believe they'll work. Then he saw that William had other lenses on his nose, and he was stunned. William didn't want to humiliate him. He took off his old lenses and tried on the new ones. These are better than the others, he said. So, I'll keep the old ones as a spare pair and will always use yours. Then he turned to me. Adza, now I shall withdraw to my cell to read those papers you know about. At last, wait for me somewhere, and thank you, thank all of you, dearest brothers. Terce was ringing and I went to the choir, to recite with the others the hymn, the psalms, the verses, and the Kyrie. The others were praying for the soul of the dead Berengar. I was thanking God for having allowed us to find not 1 but 2 pairs of lenses. In that great peace, forgetting all the ugly things I had seen and heard, I dozed off, waking only as the office ended. I realized I hadn't slept that night and I was distressed to think also how I had expended much of my strength. And at this point, coming out into the fresh air, I began to find my thoughts obsessed by the memory of the girl. Trying to distract myself, I began to stride rapidly over the grounds. I felt a slight dizziness. I clapped my numbed hands together. I stamped my feet on the earth. I was still sleepy, and yet I felt awake and full of life. I could not understand what was happening to me. Terce. In which Adza rides in the torments of love, then William arrives with Venantius's text, which remains undecipherable even after it has been deciphered. To tell the truth, the other terrible events following my sinful encounter with the girl had caused me almost to forget that occurrence, and once I had confessed to Brother William, my spirit was relieved of the remorse I had felt on waking after my guilty lapse, so it was as if I had handed over to the monk, with my words, the burden itself of which they were the signifying voice. What is the purpose of the holy cleansing of confession, if not to unload the weight of sin, and the remorse it involves, into the very bosom of our Lord, obtaining with absolution a new and airy lightness of soul, such as to make us forget the body tormented by wickedness? But I was not freed of everything. Now, as I walked in the cold, pale sun of that winter morning, surrounded by the fervor of men and animals, I began to remember my experiences in a different way. As if, from everything that had happened, my repentance and the consoling words of the penitential cleansing no longer remained, but only visions of bodies and human limbs. Into my feverish mind came abruptly the ghost of Berengar, swollen with water, and I shuddered with revulsion and pity. Then, as if to dispel that lemur, my mind turned to other images of which the memory was a fresh receptacle, and I could not avoid seeing, clear before my eyes, the eyes of the soul, but almost as if it appeared before my fleshly eyes. the image of the girl, beautiful and terrible as an army arrayed for battle. I have vowed, aged amanuensis of a text till now unwritten, though for long decades it has spoken in my mind, to be a faithful chronicler, not only out of love for the truth, or the desire, worthy though it be, to instruct my future readers, but also out of a need to free my memory, dried up and weary of visions that have troubled it for a whole lifetime. Therefore, I must tell everything, decently but without shame. And I must say, now, and clearly, what I thought then and almost tried to conceal from myself, walking over the grounds, sometimes breaking into a run so that I might attribute to the motion of my body the sudden pounding of my heart, or stopping to admire the work of the villains, deluding myself that I was being distracted by such contemplation, breathing the cold air deeply into my lungs, as a man drinks wine to forget fear or sorrow. In vain. I thought of the girl. My flesh had forgotten the intense pleasure, sinful and fleeting, a base thing, that union with her had given me. But my soul had not forgotten her face, and could not manage to feel that this memory was perverse. Rather, it throbbed as if in that face shone all the bliss of creation. I sensed, in a confused way, and almost denying to myself the truth of what I felt, that the poor, filthy, impudent creature who sold herself, who knows with what stubborn constancy, to other sinners, that daughter of Eve, weak like all her sisters, who had so often bartered her own flesh, was yet something splendid and wondrous. My intellect knew her as an occasion of sin, my sensitive appetite perceived her as the vessel of every grace. It is difficult to say what I felt. I could try to write that, still caught in the snares of sin, I desired culpably for her to appear at every moment, and I spied on the labor of the workers to see whether, around the corner of a bed or from the darkness of a barn, that form that had seduced me might emerge. But I would not be writing the truth, or rather, I would be attempting to draw a veil over the truth to attenuate its force and clarity. Because the truth is that I saw the girl. I saw her in the branches of the bare tree that stirred lightly when a benumbed sparrow flew to seek refuge there. I saw her in the eyes of the heifers that came out of the barn, and I heard her in the bleating of the sheep that crossed my erratic path. It was as if all creation spoke to me of her, and I desired to see her again, true, but I was also prepared to accept the idea of never seeing her again, and of never lying again with her, provided that I could savor the joy that filled me that morning, and have her always near even if she were to be, and for eternity, distant. It was, now I am trying to understand, as if, just as the whole universe is surely like a book written by the finger of God, in which everything speaks to us of the immense goodness of its creator, in which every creature is description and mirror of life and death, in which the humblest rose becomes a gloss of our terrestrial progress. Everything, in other words, spoke to me only of the face I had hardly glimpsed in the aromatic shadows of the kitchen. I dwelled on these fantasies because I said to myself, or rather, did not say. At that moment I did not formulate thoughts translatable into words, that if the whole world is destined to speak to me of the power, goodness, and wisdom of the Creator, and if that morning the whole world spoke to me of the girl, who, sinner though she may have been, was nevertheless a chapter in the great book of creation, a verse of the great psalm chanted by the cosmos. I said to myself, I say now, that if this occurred, it could only be a part of the great theophanic design that sustains the universe, arranged like a lyre, miracle of consonance and harmony. As if intoxicated, I then enjoyed her presence in the things I saw, and, desiring her in them, with the sight of them I was sated. And yet I felt a kind of sorrow, because at the same time I suffered from an absence, though I was happy with the many ghosts of a presence. It is difficult for me to explain this mystery of contradiction, sign that the human spirit is fragile and never proceeds directly along the paths of divine reason, which has built the world as a perfect syllogism, but instead grasps only isolated and often disjointed propositions of this syllogism, whence derives the ease with which we fall victims to the deceptions of the evil one. Was it a deception of the evil one, that morning, that so moved me? I think today that it was, because I was a novice, but I think that the human feeling that stirred me was not bad in itself, but only with regard to my state. Because in itself it was the feeling that moves man toward woman so that the one couples with the other, as the apostle of the Gentiles wants, and that both be flesh of one flesh, and that together they procreate new human beings and succor each other from youth to old age. Only the apostle spoke thus for those who seek a remedy for lust and who do not wish to burn, recalling, however, that the condition of chastity is far preferable, the condition to which as a monk I had consecrated myself. And therefore what I suffered that morning was evil for me, but for others perhaps was good, the sweetest of good things. Thus I understand now that my distress was not due to the depravity of my thoughts, in themselves worthy and sweet, but to the depravity of the gap between my thoughts and the vows I had pronounced. And therefore I was doing evil in enjoying something that was good in one situation, bad in another, and my fault lay in trying to reconcile natural appetite and the dictates of the rational soul. Now I know that I was suffering from the conflict between the illicit appetite of the intellect, in which the will's rule should have been displayed, and the illicit appetite of the senses, subject to human passions. In fact, as Aquinas says, the acts of the sensitive appetite are called passions precisely because they involve a bodily change. And my appetitive act was, as it happened, accompanied by a trembling of the whole body, by a physical impulse to cry out and to writhe. The angelic doctor says that the passions in themselves are not evil, but they must be governed by the will led by the rational soul. But my rational soul that morning was dazed by weariness, which kept in check the irascible appetite, addressed to good and evil as terms of conquest, but not the concupiscent appetite, addressed to good and evil as known entities. To justify my irresponsible recklessness of that time, I will say now that I was unquestionably seized by love, which is passion in its cosmic law, because the weight of bodies is actually natural love. And by this passion I was naturally seduced, and I understood why the angelic doctor said that amor est magis cognitivus quam cognitio, that we know things better through love than through knowledge. In fact, I now saw the girl better than I had seen her the previous night, and I understood her intus et inquit because in her I understood myself and in myself her. I now wonder whether what I felt was the love of friendship, in which like loves like and wants only the other's good, or love of concupiscence, in which one wants one's own good and the lacking wants only what completes it. And I believe that the nighttime love had been concupiscent, for I wanted from the girl something I had never had. Whereas that morning I wanted nothing from the girl, and I wanted only her good, and I wished her to be saved from the cruel necessity that drove her to barter herself for a bit of food, and I wished her to be happy. Nor did I want to ask anything further of her, but only to think of her and see her in sheep, oxen, trees, in the serene light that bathed in happiness the grounds of the abbey. Now I know that good is cause of love and that which is good is defined by knowledge, and you can only love what you have learned is good, whereas I had, indeed, learned that the girl was the good of the irascible appetite, but the evil of the will. But I was in the grip of so many and such conflicting emotions, because what I felt was like the holiest love just as the doctors describe it. It produced in me that ecstasy in which lover and beloved want the same thing, and by mysterious enlightenment I, in that moment, knew that the girl, wherever she was, wanted the same things I myself wanted, and for her I felt jealousy, but not the evil kind, condemned by Paul in 1 Corinthians, but that which Dionysius speaks of in the divine names whereby God also is called jealous because of the great love he feels for all creation. And I loved the girl precisely because she existed, and I was happy, not envious, that she existed. I was jealous in the way in which, for the angelic doctor, jealousy is modus in amidum, the jealousy of friendship, which inspires us to move against all that harms the beloved, and I dreamed, at that moment, only of freeing the girl from the power of him who was buying her flesh and befouling it with his own infamous passions. Now I know, as the doctor says, that love can harm the lover when it is excessive. And mine was excessive. I have tried to explain what I felt then, not in the least to justify what I felt. I am speaking of what were my sinful ardors of youth. They were bad, but truth obliges me to say that at the time I felt them to be extremely good. And let this serve to instruct anyone who may fall, as I did, into the nets of temptation. Today, an old man, I would know 1,000 ways of evading such seductions. And I wonder how proud of them I should be, since I am free of the temptations of the noontime devil, but not free from others, so that I ask myself whether what I am now doing is not a sinful succumbing to the terrestrial passion of recollection, a foolish attempt to elude the flow of time and death. Then, I saved myself as if by miraculous instinct. The girl appeared to me in nature and in the works of man that surrounded me. I sought then, thanks to a happy intuition of my soul, to lose myself in the